Okay. Topic of today's presentation. I'm really excited. I'm pretty passionate about this. It's by no means, I'm by no means the discoverer of this. I would say there are some pretty prominent people in this room that influenced me in my learning and trajectory into learning this style of development. But yeah, I'm really excited to speak to you all and hopefully inform you all a little bit on this and convince you on some things as well. That's my goal. That's my goal, is to convince you of some things. Before that, though, I want to just break the ice a little bit, and I want to introduce myself. My name is Tal Hobbs. I work remotely. I don't live in Vancouver. I moved away from Vancouver a number of four or 5 years ago or so, and I've been with Diligent for just over 2 years now. This is my little daughter. She's just over 2 now. This is from about 8 months ago, but a funny joke. I should introduce myself more, but the joke is funnier. As soon as I showed this picture to my wife in my practice, her first thing was like, "What? No, I'm not included in this picture." And like, I'm sorry, dear, this picture is too great to ignore. So yeah, this is my little daughter. My previous career, I used to be a teacher, and I worked with youth athletics for a long time. So I think I bring a kind of new skill set to the tech industry where yeah, I'm super passionate and love the development, but mentoring and teaching and sometimes patience, are all those skills that you learn as a teacher and have benefited me a lot. My objectives for today. See, here we are teaching already, right? Starting off my thing with objectives. What we're going to do is I want to start off by reviewing a sort of more typical serverless approach, not typical, but more traditional serverless approach, as we use a simple get endpoint as an example, for which we are going to explore how we could implement that same endpoint using service full and or no code approach. And most importantly, what I want to do is I want to convince you why you should care about this and how impactful it can be on your teams, on your development, and the long-term life of your application that you're building. So to begin, let's start with the first part. I want to introduce you to a pretty standard serverless approach to building a simple get endpoint. And so let's imagine that typically when I would go to build an endpoint, I would think, okay, I've got my gateway configured. I need to make a query against in this case, we're going to use DynamoDB. And I'm going to use a Lambda in between to connect that gateway to that Dynamo. The gateway will probably proxy the request through to my Lambda. My Lambda will structure the query as needed, receive the items from Dynamo, and then it will format the response object as well as which maybe an error code if needed, and or just return the success with the formulated response object. Now, what we're going to look at a little bit closer here next up is what to continue this sample scenario. Let's look at some data that we're going to use, or the data structure and some access patterns that we'll use. But the endpoint that we're going to look at is as up here. We're going to get some books. In those books, within that a book will be some chapters, and within a chapter will be some pages. And what we're going to get is we're going to request those pages that belong to that chapter. So what does the data look like? As we can imagine, we have books, we have chapters, and we have pages. This top item here is our book. As we see, our partition key, all of these items belong to the same partition of the book partition and sorted by the book. The chapters is then uniquely identified with the chapter ID suffixed onto the book. And so, again, with the page is suffixed onto the chapter. So if we want to request if we were going to make a query against this table to say, please get me all pages that belong to book 1 and chapter 1, we could write a query that look like this. Now, this is just a CLI request that we could make to the AWS CLI. And we're going to say, hey, query this Dynamo, please. I want to reference this table. And I'm want to filter against, or as I'll use proper terminology, the expression at the expression at the key condition expression I want to use is partition key is going to be equal to my book, and the sort key is going to begin with my book, my chapter, and page. That way, any page number after that would be prefixed with this, and that would be our access pattern to access all the pages in this book for a given chapter. Now, up to this point, this is the reason I wanted to use this scenario as an example is because my team and I were actually doing something super similar. We were creating a very basic endpoint to just serve up some data, in this case, to serve up these pages. And as we were doing this, we started having to make decisions immediately about this Lambda. We didn't have to make them at time of development because a lot of them were already made when the application was initially configured. But some of the decisions that we either made at time of development or were assumed because they were made prior to us getting on the team or whoever configured the application and whatnot, was to begin with immediately, like what language are we going to use? What version of that language? So for example, on my team, we typically use Node. And so we just adopted, we're going to use Node 14 because that is consistent with the rest of the application. Why would we change, right? Next up, we were thinking, well, how should we provision this Lambda, right? We're creating a new Lambda. How much memory does it need? I could go on, right? But how should we provision? Is the provisioning of this Lambda going to be appropriate for the most effective, for its cost? Decisions that we either assume or have been made for us or have to be made at development, at time of development. Next up, we haven't even discussed how should we package it, right? Because we're developing this in Node or Python or Go or any language, right? We still have to package it. Where should it live? Logs. I put a basic logs here because logs can go into so much, right? If we needed to audit the functionality or what happened, do we have the appropriate logs we need? Are we catching appropriate errors? Are we logging those errors appropriately? Are we logging the incoming events appropriately? These are all decisions that are either assumed because of like practices that were implemented at time of application implementation, or we're trusting the developer and the developer's code reviewer to ensure that they know what they're doing. And of course, things get missed, and that's okay, things get missed, right? But again, we're trusting. What libraries, packages, test coverage? Are we going to avoid regression appropriately because of the test coverage that we have? I already mentioned this. Are we handling errors in the Lambda program? I could go on with these questions that we are either asking ourselves at time of development, or were made for us at the time of the application when it was first instantiated. But what I want to do is I want to challenge us. What if we could remove the need to make these decisions? What if we could rely on a service like AWS, who we at Diligent are treating as our development framework, more so than a service? What if we could rely on them to make these decisions for us? What benefit would it offer? Would it be performant? Would it be cost effective? Does it add or remove complexities? These are the types of, this is my challenge statement. These are the types of questions that I want to get into as we talk more about moving away from that more traditional serverless approach with the Lambda being our main driver to potentially some other options. So to begin answering that question, I want to begin with a definition. So what do I mean by serviceful and or no code development? Well, a pretty standard definition that if you Google it spits out at you saying, well, this describes a pattern where service configuration is used to implement solutions instead of application code in order to reduce complexity and speed up delivery time. Now, in my talk synopsis, I was a little bit tricky, to be honest. I said, how far could we get without writing any application code? And I think that's tricky because I'm going to show you some code in this presentation, but I would challenge our understanding or our view of that code and say, is it application code? In my opinion, not really. The reason it's not, is, in my opinion, it's configuration or configuration. It's code that configures or configures orchestration. Now, the reason I make that differentiation, and I think that's an important differentiation, is because all of what we're doing, what I'm going to show you today, could be done from within AWS console. There's no need to write any JavaScript or Python or anything like that to implement either of these solutions, and you could do them all pretty much by dropping and dragging or inputting into forms within the AWS console. So a couple examples. These are the two examples that I want to walk through today. They're examples that are that were very much introduced to me within the organization, and that we've continued to explore within the team and to really challenge ourselves to embrace. But the two solutions that we're going to do, the first one on the left is what we're going to look at first, which is let's just get rid of the Lambda altogether. Why do we even need it? Let's challenge ourselves to connect the API gateway directly to DynamoDB. And if so, what I want to explore today is like, well, how much functionality does this offer us? That's actually what I want to do. How much functionality does this offer us? The second option, we're going to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to instead of removing that intermediate step, we're going to say, let's explore the benefits of replacing that Lambda with a step function. What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? Why should we even bother trying to do this? These are the types of questions we're trying to address with that. So let's dive in. To begin with, we're going to switch view. We're going to move away from PowerPoint. I want to look at AWS Gateway here and introduce you to the gateway. And then from there, we'll get more into the details of that first example of connecting this API gateway directly with DynamoDB. So in this gateway, we recognize the pattern of the resources here to that URL that we looked at earlier. We have our books. It's going to be defined. We're going to look at a particular book ID. We then have chapters, which is going to be defined by a specific chapter ID. And then we have these two endpoints. These are the two implementations that we were just showing. We have the pages underscore DDB, which is a direct integration from API Gateway to DynamoDB. And then we have this pages step function endpoint, which is going to be the other one, which is going to be the API Gateway to step function to DynamoDB. So to begin with, though, let's look at the pages direct integration. To begin with, I think it's the best way to introduce this is to not actually look at the code. By look at the code, I mean what I've done is I actually configured this using the AWS Cloud Development Kit, their CDK. But I think that it is more clear to a fresh set of eyes if we look at how the API Gateway is actually configured in the console here, and then we can go look at how it's configured via the code. Well, what we're looking at here is not what we're looking at here. What I want to highlight is that I haven't hooked this up to an authorizer. I've just got a personal API key so that I can limit anyone trying to just hit this endpoint. But the main areas of focus that we're going to look at is this integration request and integration response. And we can see that this method is directly speaking to a DynamoDB. It's not speaking to a specific table. It's just speaking to DynamoDB. And so when we configure this, we're going to take a look at when we configure this integration. Let's take a look closely at this request. And then after, take a look at the response. Now, the request, what are we doing in the request? The request is where we define that query that we looked at in the PowerPoint, that CLI query, that query that we were going to make using the CLI. We're going to take a look. Okay, this is all configuration. That's pretty easy to look up and see how this is configured. But what I really want to focus on is these mapping templates. Now, the reason I want to focus on this is because this is where the real meat of this integration really lies. How are we going to tell API Gateway, or how are we going to configure API Gateway to generate that query and get the appropriate records from DynamoDB? Well, if we compare this if we compare this structure here to the CLI, the CLI query that we're making, it's very, very similar. Let's explore that. So first of all, we have our table name. We're going to speak to the same table. We're defining this is the table in DynamoDB that we want to make a request again, that we're going to query. We have our key condition expression. On the CLI, we said that our partition key is going to be as defined, the book ID, and that the sort key is going to begin with the sort key that we defined earlier. Now, the magic here is that before, that was hard-coded, right? The book ID and the chapter IDs were hard-coded. But what API Gateway actually allows us to do is it allows us to dynamically configure or dynamically set, let's say, set the book ID, aka the partition key, and the value that we want to begin have the sort key begin with. So I'm going to replace this, and we can use this. Okay, and so now this looks the exact same as a query that we had using AWS CLI. But a question, right? Like, where does this fit into API Gateway? What are we doing here? Where am I getting this book one? Why am I allowed to simply replace that? Well, what API Gateway does, it allows this integration mapping template to reference the context of the request. API Gateway provides that context, or it provides certain things in that context that we're allowed to reference and build this query here. So some things that we're allowed to reference are any values in the URL. So for example, there we had books, book ID, chapters, chapter ID. So we can use the book ID and the chapter ID, like I was saying here. So we have method, request, path, and then we can get the book ID. Now this structure, this syntax, there we go. This syntax is provided to us by AWS. It's documented on their API Gateway documentation. So not only does it allow us to get values from the URL, it also allows us to get values that the authorizer may output for us. So the context within the authorizer, and it also allows us to get values for, say, query parameters or out of the request body, like in a post or a pull request. I don't want to talk too much more about this because there are some, well, let's talk about it right now, actually. There are some limitations to what we can do here. This integration mapping template really only allows us to perform one action here. If you can see here, I could not go like this, and well, actually, I would not be able to go like this and add a second query in here. Yeah, sadly, that's not feasible. So it only allows us to perform one action and interact with one other service one time. So for example, here we're interacting with DynamoDB one time.
Yeah, Thomas, just a small question. So
yes.
Like, how do you tell API Gateway that it actually have to go to DynamoDB? Because this is body, right? But how do you like say
Sure.
that this is integration for the DynamoDB in particular?
Sure. Yeah. So that is up here. So let's take a look back at the method, and the method itself. So within the method itself, again, this is we would do this as part of the integration request. We would come into here into the integration request, and in here we can see that we are integrating this API Gateway with another AWS service. We're going to specify which region the service is in, and we're going to specify which service we want to speak to. We're going to have this service speak directly to this gateway. This integration be a DynamoDB integration. The other details in here are that this is pretty important. When we are communicating with DynamoDB, it needs to always be a post, which kind of is counterintuitive, right? Because we're trying to like get items out of DynamoDB. But if you have to think, this mapping template here that we were looking at is actually the body of that request. And so post actions, post verbs, post requests will have that body. So if you think about it in that way, it kind of makes more sense. We then get to specify which action we're going to perform. against when we hit that DynamoDB, as well as we're going to configure a few other options, like for example, the IAM role that we need to perform that execution, as well as just pass through, to say that we're just going to pass through the body and the response will just be passed through in return. Yeah, any other follow-up questions? I fully expect there to be some questions about this.
What other database types are supported for the AWS service entry there?
Yeah, great question. In terms of database types, to be honest, I'm not going to be the most proficient to answer that question. However, one of the things I did want to say was that this actually is not just limited to database types. Well, someone may argue that S3 is in fact a database type, but that's an arguable definition, But yeah, you can set this up to integrate directly with S3 and serve up files, for example. One implementation that we've done on the team is instead of we set up a greedy endpoint so that an API gateway could serve up actual web page, web application. So it would make a request to, I believe the endpoint was just the index, and it would go directly to S3. The URL would determine which file the front-end application the SPA was requesting, and we would return those directly to the requester.
That would be good to know about S3. How about Postgres? Or
yeah. Again, I've never played with that. I've never played with that.
You click on that edit button there. Does it?
Sure.
Yeah. Just see what's there. Oh, I see so many.
Yeah.
Is there an Aurora in the top?
Let's check it out.
Or try P, Postgres.
It's probably RDS. Thomas, can you check RDS?
Yeah,
RDS is possible. I think you have to
RDS, yeah.
Data APIs. So probably with data APIs, it should integrate.
Yeah, the RDS would be the Postgres there, I guess. Yes. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So many options are there. That's really good to know.
Yeah. Hence why I'm like, I've never played with that, because the options are too exhaustive,
Good.
Any more questions? I have a question. My question for myself is, well, what about the response? Okay, when we make a query to DynamoDB, what we're going to do actually, I just want to share, let me put in, book 1 and chapter 1. Okay, when I make this request, ignore the response body. We're going to talk about the response body next, but what I want us to look at is when we take a look at, this is going to fail. Actually, I already have this prepared. When we take a look, when we do make this request, DynamoDB actually responds with an object that looks like this. Oops. Right, this is the response that DynamoDB will return to us. Will return to our API gateway. Now, as we can all see, this is not going to be useful to any consumer of our API. We're going to need to manipulate this and formulate our response object as desired. So what I want to do now is really show a very simple example of how we can do that, how we can manipulate this response object into this response from Dynamo into a more appropriate response for our consumers. To do that, let's go back in here. Now here we do see what that response object, what I would like that to look like. So we've taken that items object and we've destructured it and reformatted it into just returning the book ID, the chapter ID, and the page ID. So again, let's go back into our API gateway configuration and take a look at the response. I don't really want to get too much into what we're looking at here regarding the regex of these response codes. The reason being, this is more getting into the meat, the details of API Gateway. But to summarize quickly, what we're doing here is we're just setting up and saying that any response from the integration, when it has a 200 response code. Now, this is not our response to the clients, to the consumer. This is the response from the integration. So when Dynamo comes back to us with a 200 response code, we will use this mapping template to configure and respond. If, say, we set up another one like a regex against 4xx or 5xx, we could configure how a different mapping template to respond with. Say we wanted to return different error messages in those cases, we could configure those. But what will happen in this case, those will just default through, and the error message will just get returned to the consumer. But when Dynamo returns with a 200 saying the request was successful, here is my response. What I want to do again is I want to take that list of items and I want to formulate into my desired response object. So apologies, I forgot to mention before that these mapping templates use a specific language. They use the Apache Velocity template language, VTL as it's short named. Let's talk about VTL in a little bit, but I do want to just highlight here that this is like a pretty different feeling syntax to like most programming languages, in that it provides a ton of flexibility, and that the only the only lines that will not be included in the response are prefixed by the hashtag. And so they provide us some functionality. Like for here, what we're doing is I'm setting an input root local variable that references the input path. Now, what is this input path? So this input path is following follows another syntax that AWS uses within these mapping templates called JSON path. And when the integration responds, so in this case, when DynamoDB responds, it'll come back with its own structure. And at the root of it will be the response object. Well, actually, let's go look at it. Let's just go look at it instead of me trying to terribly try and describe it. As we see, if we scroll down here, the response object, here's the request. And the response object we'll see here, just right here. We'll see, yeah, we returned with 100. The response was the query found 100 items. And here is that list of items. You can also configure it to have more, but this is a pretty, if you've worked with DynamoDB at all and you made requests to the CLI, you'll recognize this response object. It's Dynamo's pretty standard response. So again, I want to format that. I want to structure that into a consumable response. So I'm going to navigate back to the mapping template. I was clicking very quickly there, apologies. What we're doing is we're setting a local root element that if we look here, we're going to reuse. And this has the items as we saw in the JSON object previously. And I want to iterate through each of these. And in so, I want to build my JSON object that I want my consumer to use. But what about the array? Like this is going to be an array of objects. All I have to do is I have to set this open bracket above and this close bracket below. And then in between, it will iterate through. Now, again, this, as I say, this is like, it feels quite different to most programming languages in the way that it is just like, let me put it this way. When I think about this Apache Velocity template, I don't think of it as like a programming language. I think of it as it building a template. And so it behaves quite differently. And so for me, that is how I've thought about this. I'm going to stop talking about this here because, no, I'll talk about it a little bit more, sorry. So this VTL, this Apache Velocity template within API Gateway, it's really, really neat. It's really neat. It allows so much flexibility with how we can manipulate and restructure this response object. What I've done here is really basic. I've just extracted items out of the JSON object in the context and formulated the response. But let's say I wanted to filter, right? Let's say I had filter parameters on my request, and I wanted to say like only return the first 10 pages in the chapter. I could put another if statement inside here. I'm not going to program that on the fly for you guys, but I could put another one in here that could check if my page number is less than include this this template or skip it. It would also allow me to manipulate these values right here. I could again put an if statement and say if page was greater than 10, I don't know, set it to some, I don't know, funny text or some joke or something. It just, I'm trying to say is it's quite flexible, and with a bit of creativity, you can really manipulate your response objects in many different ways. The one way that I have not found that I thought might be valuable is if I wanted to sort my response object in ways that I had not configured in my access pattern on DynamoDB. The appropriate way would be to configure that access pattern in DynamoDB and have my sort key sort my response in the desired manner before I even got to this point. But let's say you didn't have that and you wanted to sort by name instead of page. I haven't found a way to do that. VTL does have. So VTL is an extension, typically an extension of a Java programming of a Java framework. I believe it's for developing UI components within a Java template language. I'm not sure. But in that context, there are different libraries that you can add on to the VTL. But within the API Gateway here, it's very limited with what API Gateway allows you to configure or allows you to work with. Any questions about this response mapping, this response template? Cool.
Question.
Yes.
How do you know what you can use, for example, in this language? Like how you learn about all of this stuff? Because like actually right now you're showing like 4. Like I remember time when I was writing PHP and it's very similar. It looks like very similar, but how do you know? Because PHP has like a lot of documentation, but how do you learn about this stuff?
The Apache Velocity template language, template builder language. I feel wrong saying language because it doesn't feel like language. However, it is fairly thoroughly documented. If you do look up Apache Velocity template, it is fairly thoroughly documented. However, it is not very well documented within this context of API Gateway. It has been one of the major challenges on the team has been what is provided by API Gateway and what isn't provided by API Gateway. And I specifically say API Gateway and not AWS, because AWS does use this template language elsewhere within their platform. For example, in AppSync, they also use the VTL to do the same thing, to configure their integrations, AppSync's integrations. If we had the functionality of AppSync, the VTL and AppSync within API Gateway would be so nice. Why? Because there is an endpoint that AppSync has provides you, which is to validate your templates. I've even thought about validating my API Gateway templates against AppSync, but the functionality between the two services is so drastic that I think is more of a risk to validate my template against the AppSync than it is to trust it and to assume that my template is valid or behaving the way I want it to. So to answer your question directly, Yuri, what's the best way? The way that we on the team have found to work with these VTLs is we do reference to VTL template documentation, the Apache Velocity template documentation, and we really try and narrow our creativity to what is on the AWS API Gateway documentation as well. As soon as we start branching beyond that, those two documents, we find ourselves getting in trouble. So what I would like to do now is I'd like to, I want to ask again, any more questions? Because what we're going to do now is we're going to move away from the console, and I want to show how easy it is to configure this in CDK. Okay, great. The last thing I did want to show actually before I move away is just how performant this actually is. This whole request, 62 milliseconds. No cold starts, no warm starts.
Moreover, like it's almost the same from any region.
yeah. It's also cheap. It's also so cheap, right? There's no worry about paying for Lambda. There's no worry about provisioning it. There's no worrying about logs. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I love this so much that like right now, I don't know if anyone else in here uses Node 14, but if you do and you've tried compiling it lately, it gives you this huge message in your terminal saying, hey, this is deprecated very quick. You better upgrade soon. I don't ever have to worry about any of that with this. AWS will manage this for not forever, but AWS will manage this. And when I say reduce complexity and increase implementation time, well, in my opinion, I'm investing in my future self by investing into learning about this now, because AWS will manage this. AWS, if they have to upgrade, if they actually introduce any performance improvements or anything like that, I get that automatically. I don't have to go in and think about how to upgrade my Node version to take advantage of the latest and greatest, So anyways, that's my favorite part about this.
Thales, how comfortable you to read questions from chat? There is a question.
Great, yeah. I just don't see it.
I can read it for you.
Sure, yeah.
How capable is this on large responses up to streaming responses? If velocity offers like global state, this might be problematic. Global state. Could you clarify what means global state? But in general, like first part of this question, like just imagine like huge response, like how it works with it.
It's a great question. It's a great question. I've never benchmarked this on like large data pieces of data. The largest I've worked with is like in the thousands, and I've had no problems with it. But I'm not going to pretend like I can answer that question intelligently. So yeah, apologies. I've never benchmarked it on.
Yeah, but in general, like this protocol, I mean that we use right now for response, for example, like this API Gateway, usage. It's not supposed to be used as a streaming protocol, because there are different protocols for streaming, for example, like WebSocket, gRPC, and like probably HTTP not the best thing for protocol, because it usually causes a lot of different issues.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's also limited by response time from API Gateway, right? So API
for sure.
Yeah. 29 seconds.
29 seconds to return response. And in case of DynamoDB, as an example, you better use pagination than return everything in one big response.
Because actually DynamoDB by itself has a response limit, and this response limit 1 megabyte of data scanned. It doesn't mean that like you show 1 megabyte. If it scans 1 megabyte of data, you need to use pagination for this response. But other services have like different limits. For example, like if you use RDS, you probably can overload. But if you use like some like intermediate service just to get access there, like you need to be very careful, because there might be some limits applied in between.
Yeah, thanks. Great. CDK code. So we're gonna go ahead.
Before we go there, may I ask you one thing? Could
Please.
you just remind all of us what means CDK?
Yeah, CDK is AWS's cloud development kit. I think I nailed that. I looked it up yesterday to remind myself. But the desire of it, the whole point, the reason that we are investing it and driving it in Diligent is that we're trying to find a way to make it easy and to make it easy for developers to not only onboard and to learn how, but to continue using to continue not using, but implement AWS services as code. So for example, one way that I traditionally did it was using CloudFormation templates. And so I would spend like hours, honestly, configuring JSON objects or I use JSON, but configuring JSON to configure my AWS services. What CDK allows us to do is use more familiar development practices and languages. So at Diligent, we use TypeScript to programmatically define those CloudFormation templates in order to configure our AWS services programmatically, rather than having to navigate through the AWS console and configure those services one environment in one region at a time. And you get all the benefits that come along with that programmatic ability, like versioning control, source control, the ability to replicate and build up and tear down environments as needed. We could go on, but yeah, that's the AWS CDK language. And let's skip there now, as we're going to take a step back. We're going to slow down again. We're going to take a look. Now the time, hey, Yuri, I just want to check in. What's my time? It's 6:30. How much time do I have left? Like 10 minutes type thing, 20 minutes?
Actually, we have 1 more hour.
Okay, great. So I can take my time. Will probably be about another half hour. I suspect that will be how much time will take. So anyways, I can step back and I want to start from the beginning. So I'm not going to dive in because again, the focus of this is not to inform everyone with CDK, but I do want to just slowly step through and say, here's where we're configuring this, here's where we're configuring this, and then take a look at the integration configuration. And hopefully what we'll do is we'll see similarities between what we saw in the console and then what we see in the code. And I hope someone has catched me and said, you said no application code. Well, again, in my opinion, this is not application code. This is code that is configuring services. So I know I'm being pedantic, but I'm trying to be a little bit funny there. So anyways, first thing we do here, we are configuring my Dynamo table. We can see that there's the name and there is a partition key and a sort key. Later in the code, I did seed it somewhere else. So if anyone is curious or would like to, yeah, for sure, happy to share this code. Here I'm configuring a very basic API gateway. I'm ensuring that I'm adding logs, because that was one of the points that I made earlier. How can I ensure that I've got appropriate logging for either auditing or to ensure functionality? I'm logging at both the method level as well as at the integration level. I'm also enabling data tracing and basic integration tracing. I'm configuring a role that will allow that I'll use across these integrations so that the API gateway is able to communicate with the desired DynamoDB table. And I'm configuring my different resources here. So we can see I'm configuring my book resource, configuring my chapter resource, and we can see my book is suffixed by the book ID, my chapters is suffixed by the chapter ID, and then I have my 2 different endpoints. The first one we're going to talk about is the DDB integration, and then later we'll follow up with the step function integration. The DDB integration, I hope everyone, I'm just going to say like this is it. This is all the code. It's not quite it. There's a few VTL templates that we're going to look at, but this is it. This is all it takes me to write my Git endpoint. To be honest, when I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, you know what? I'll even prepare a Lambda function we can compare. And I got to it and I was like, I just can't be bothered. I don't want to write all that code for this presentation. I just stopped with the integration because it's so much quicker. Yes, there's some onboarding and some learning to be had to understand, to ramp up to the working with the Apache velocity template language. But in my opinion, totally worth it. So let's take a look. So again, we're configuring a new AWS integration. We're saying this is going to integrate with Dynamo. We're going to perform a query. We are assigning, or we are associating the gateway role with this integration. And then here's the magic. Here's where we're saying, what is the request template? And what is the response template? And if you remember the request template, hopefully this looks familiar. The request template looks like this. And so I've saved it here in a VTL file. But what I'm going to do with it is I'm actually just going to read the file and just attach it here as a string. It's just a key value pair, and it's a string here. So you can manipulate this in any way you want, the string at this point. So some things that we've done on the team is that we've actually saved the VTL one way. And then at time when we want to actually integrate it with the endpoint or the integration, is we manipulate that string. Like we put placeholders in there and we replace those placeholders with particular values. Like the main thing that we do is we replace the Dynamo table that we want to do with other tables that we maybe for like test environments and so forth. Again, the exact same thing with the response template. If you remember in the console, we said that, well, we're just going to take all successful responses from the integrated service, in this case, Dynamo, and we're going to use that mapping template to formulate that response object. And the response object looks like this. We're going to read this VTL file as a string and associate it with the integration. I'm setting some cores. I didn't have to for the presentation, but I kind of just wanted to leave it here just to sort of show it as an example that, yeah, we can for sure easily manipulate this integration and extend it to fit a more professional, use case almost, or business level use case. Any questions? Any questions about this integration code?
Any questions about this integration code? Are you going to make it open source?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. And we are going to share it like as comment like for this event.
Sure, sure.
One question. So after this is the initial CloudFormation configuration code, right? And you showed us that this becomes editable online after you run it once. Is that true?
Sorry. So I've done it once, and then I didn't quite understand the second part.
So once you run this once,
Yes.
when you go to the AWS console, does it allow you to refine it further?
It does. Yes.
Okay.
So actually, let's pretend we're doing that, right? And actually, this is one of the ways that I prefer to develop with it, is because I'll configure it like this locally in the CDK, and actually sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I did develop it first time directly in the console, but often what I'll do is I'll come and I'll configure my integration like this, and then I'll step over to the AWS console, and I'll do my development and debugging here, just like I did here. I put in a book ID and a chapter ID, and let's say that I did this. Oh, one sec. Let me refresh. Yeah, I did this. And I should have gotten some pages back. So what my next step would be, or often, to be honest, it throws an error at me and it says there's like an integration error. What I will often do is I'll open up two tabs like this, and integration request. I'll come in here into my mapping template, and I will actually manipulate it here within this console here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cheat a little bit and just throw a 1 on the end of the this, right, to reflect the desired chapter. I'm going to save it. I think I can run it right now. I may have to deploy it. Let's see. Oh yeah, there we go. So it does. And if what would happen then, if I were then to go, well, if I were then to come back here to my configuration code and deploy it, of course, it would overwrite my changes in the console. But my development practice that I tend to do is I tend to work with the integration in the console until I've defined it and figured out how I need it, and then come over to my VTL files and paste them in there, so I know that I have functioning as I would like.
Yeah, that helps, Talis. Yeah, you can go back and forth, I guess. You can try out small changes in the console and then come here and make it permanent, I suppose, right?
Yeah, it dramatically speeds up development time, right? Because waiting to deploy your CloudFormation template every time, it's not long, but it's also not immediate, right? Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
You would kill your DynamoDB as well, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Talis,
Hey.
quick question about your VTL experience. You know, that sort of developed experience that you're showing specifically with VTL. I have always found in my experience that I find VTL fairly frustrating to deal with. It's every time I use API Gateway, it's my least favorite part of using API Gateway. Like if I had to rank, you know, a tier list of the bottom tier developer experiences, it would be like debugging seg faults in C++, DOM manipulation with vanilla JavaScript, and then just a little bit above that using Apache VTL. So I'm curious about your experience though. Like, have you found it easy to read, write? Have you found error handling easy to write in it? How about the debugging experience when, you know, you get things wrong?
Depends which day you ask me, Greg. By that I mean some days when it goes smooth, I love it. You know, it's just so dynamic and flexible. When it comes to days where exactly I'm having to debug, I'm having to like figure out errors, it can be extremely challenging. I've read numerous articles online discussing this as well, and they say the same thing. The main challenge is the development experience with it. And I really highlight AppSync in here. And I said, and I really do wish that API Gateway had the same functionality to validate a template like AppSync does, because there's just so much trial and error when using API Gateway that the only feedback you get is that there's an integration error. And so you're kind of left struggling in the dark to try and figure out what it is. Now, the one saving grace is that even when there is an integration error, if you scroll down into the response, if you test it in this UI, excuse me, scroll all the way down, you do get to see what your resulting request template is in here. And you can compare that with what you desired against what the results is, right? What you don't get to see, though, is you don't really get to see the response template, which often is just as error prone as the request template, right? So yeah, and another real challenge that we faced is, well, we're performing dynamic actions in these templates. How do we write automated tests against this? We don't have a good solution at this point, to be honest. We've tried a few different things, and we've actually found that the library one implementation that we currently have, a friend of mine implemented it. It uses a JavaScript-based VTL implementation, and we actually compile our VTLs with some test data, and we can actually can't think of the actually test against the results of that VTL manipulating the data. But the problem is that it's a JavaScript-based VTL implementation. And so the difference between, it's a JavaScript-based. And so the difference between that and the implementation on API Gateway is that API Gateway is a Java-based implementation of VTL. And so you want to use methods like includes. Well, guess what? It works in JavaScript or the other way around. But then you have to use contains in Java. And so your tests don't actually reflect the actual functionality of the VTL within API Gateway. So I wish that there was a validate template endpoint on API Gateway, and it would make this way smoother. Honestly, the one thing that we are in current discussion on our team and arguing back and forth with about is, well, really, this implementation, this endpoint, really warrants end-to-end testing, API end-to-end testing. And if we had that level of coverage, do we really need to invest in further lower level test, like on the test pyramid, lower level test implementations? Because if you look at this code, what application code do we have? It's so minimal, it's so basic. Do we really need to invest in it? Do we really need to support it in the future? Maybe just a simple API endpoint test covers and is the most appropriate way to test this and ensure functionality and to avoid regression. Because with this VTL, there is chance of regression, right? Not in terms of the integration and the configuration, but this, one could argue, with some application code, right? However, we love it. We have absolutely loved this, and we try every time we write or manipulate a new endpoint to try and follow this approach. To be fair, this direct integration we haven't used too many times. Usually we have to do some more complicated business logic than what the mapping template allows. Let's go back and review that quickly. So within the request, we have our mapping template. And we see here that I am performing some basic business logic. We're taking the book ID out of the URL and the chapter ID out of the URL, and we are building this query statement. But what if we have to do things like we have to check the user's role, we have to check whether the record exists, or when we want to update a record or want to create a record, and so forth. There's some extra business logic around. Often, we move away from this implementation approach of the direct integration, and we use that step function example. I want to go take a look at that now. I'm going to skip back to the PowerPoint, and so we've talked about this. We've talked about this. Yes, I want to talk about the replacing of the Lambda with a step function. Now, what discussion we've had internally and with oftentimes with new members joining the team is they say like, whoa. Step function is for orchestration. Why are you using a step function to perform some business logic here? Well, actually, if you read AWS documentation, they do say that step functions can be used to perform some basic business logic, as well as perform some more basic I can't think of the right word, but to perform different actions with other AWS services. In this case, we'll look at DynamoDB. But why? Again, why? Why replace this Lambda with a step function? It's configuration. It might be complex. It may be complex. It may not be as easy to configure as writing some TypeScript for a Lambda. It may be difficult to test. It may need, how are we going to confirm if there is business logic in it? How are we going to confirm that business logic is behaving as desired? But again, I'm going to present all those decisions that we had to make at the start. We don't have to make. We don't have to decide on a language. We don't have to worry about the logs. We don't have to worry about provisioning. We do have to decide on the type of step function, whether we want an express or The other one's slipping my mind right now. Again, we don't really have to worry about like step functions can run for a long time, so they offer a ton of benefits in that way. But again, these decisions are offloaded from the team and they're put on our service provider of AWS. Questions? Let's dive into an example. My state machine, not very complex. We can imagine though, that there were maybe some business logic, some decisions that we had to make prior to getting the managed dashboards, but this state here is going to perform that same query that we are making using the CLI and using that integration mapping template. We're just going to get the pages that belong to a chapter that belong to a book. I didn't want to go into detail and make this more complex, the step function, because what I want to talk about is not actually about the step function and the functionality of the step function. What I want to talk about is the integration and the no-code development approach. So that's kind of why I've left that as so basic. But again, I want to go into the AWS console and let's take a look at what this integration looks like from API Gateway to the step function to DynamoDB. Again, the two focus points that we need to worry about are integration request and integration response. We have configured this, that it's a generic, just like DynamoDB. If you guys are familiar with this at all with Lambda, set up a proxy, it'll specify which Lambda you're going to communicate with or integrate with, sorry. But in this scenario, we're just saying we're going to integrate with step functions. And in the request body, in the mapping template, we'll take a look at this in a sec. In the mapping template, we are going to specify exactly which state machine we're going to send this request to. So as before, let's take a look at this integration configuration. We're going to say, again, we're going to communicate this integration is going to be with another AWS service, which region it is. As we looked at before, which service of that giant list of services. Again, it needs to be a post because we're passing through the body. And we're going to, this is specific to the step function. We're going to start a synchronous execution. And then again, we have our execution role that we configured in CDK we saw a minute ago. And that's, again, the same setup as before. We're going to set the pass-through and we're going to use the default timeout. So usually when you configure a step function, you have to pass it an input. Not configure, but usually when you are executing a step function, you have to pass it an input. And that input will act as the state, the entry state of that step function. So what values you may want to use throughout that step function, throughout the execution of that step function. What we need to do is we need to configure that here in our mapping template. Say, here's the information you need to execute and perform the action that I need you to perform, or the actions or the steps that I need you to perform. In this case, we're going to pass it a book ID, which we are getting from the path book ID. Notice that I have changed the structure of this here. I wanted to show there are two different ways actually of accessing this book ID. We then can access the chapter ID. Sorry, I should have said that differently. The step function is going to need both the book ID and the chapter ID to generate that query. So I'm going to pass both those in the input. And then the state machine itself is just referencing the ARN of the state machine for which I would like to call. It is important to note that my role needs to have execution permissions to initiate that execution in the state machine. But other than that, that's all we need to do. So say, for example, this role we wanted to reuse across all of our endpoints, we could configure this role to give API Gateway to execute any of the step functions that we used or any of the gateway tables, Dynamo tables that we needed. Or you could be more narrow, right, and configure a role specific to each integration. Any questions about this mapping template here? One thing that always got me at first was, why are we escaping all these quotations in here? Well, it's because that this JSON object is in fact the value of this key. So it just needs to be a stringified JSON. Now, let me tell you, this, to speak to Greg's question earlier, this is the most challenging, what's the right word? It has been the largest challenge my team has faced when working with these integration mapping templates, is how to appropriately escape our different params or different values that we need to extract out of the context to build this input object. Because the documentation on AWS is convoluted for this part. So
one question, tell us.
Yeah.
ARN name for state machine, is it an auto-generated one? It looks too long to me. If you scroll right, please. Yeah.
Good question. It is not an auto-generated one. I mean, it is, but where is my name for it? Good API. I think I forget what I called it, but you're right. It's a good question. So what this is this is a CDK generated name for this step function. Let's go take a look at it, and then you can actually see what the step function looks like. Yeah. What did I name it? Let me come back here and find what I named it. No, that's the wrong. I stole this from something else. However, it should say that in there. No, so what this is this is a CDK. So I passed this construct in CDK an ID, and it takes this ID and suffixes it sorry, what CDK actually does is it takes your different constructs and resources that you're building, and it generates a construct tree so that you can like differentiate the different relationships between the different services. So for example, in my API gateway, I would have some different resources underneath my gateway in a tree, in like just like a JSON object kind of. And then within those resources, I could have different functions, and I could build a relationship tree. Now, what CDK does is it takes that tree and it builds my resource name out of that tree, also suffixes stuff if it has space to suffix it with.
Oh, so this is not, you don't specify the name in your template.
I do specify the name, but what CDK does is it takes that name and it allows it to be uniquely different from another implementation. Like let's say you and I were working in the same region, in the same account, and we both wanted to deploy our CDK stack. We could slightly differentiate them based off of a unique identifier that CDK would apply. Now, I'm not explaining that exactly right, but that's pretty close to what it's doing.
That's fine, Thomas. Thank you.
Template. I was talking about the template. And so, yeah, this is how we're determining which step function that this integration is going to call, which is just here in the mapping template. So again, I don't want to look too much at the step function because that's not really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the integration. And so let's go back again and take a look at the response. It looks very similar to the previous integration, the direct DynamoDB one. But I've made this one a little bit different because let's go away from here. It'll be much easier for us to look at in VS Code. But this one has quite a bit more functionality in it than the direct integration did. And what I wanted to highlight here is that, look, I'm still building the same response object as I was from the direct integration. But what we're also doing is we are reading different pieces of information that the step function is able to return. So remember what I said was that using a step function allows us to perform some simple checks or actions based off of our business logic and behave in the desired resulting manner. So like a common one, let's say we wanted to update an existing record. In the step function, we could first confirm that that record exists. If it didn't, we could return a formatted error. Now, the way we and my team have formatted that response error is that, yeah, we just return we attach an error key to all of our response objects. We'll define what the error code is, and then we will set the response context, meaning the response status code, to the desired status code. And then we will just basically return the JSON object that we have configured for that error. So for example, in this case, it would be, we put it as the error is not found, and then we'll have an error message that is associated with that, a more, descriptive error message. So again, what we're looking at, I just wanted to show is the flexibility that VTL provides. With a little bit of creativity, we can really do a lot within these mapping templates. Again, there's limits to it, and there's challenges working with it. But once it's in place, we really enjoy it. Gregory, question.
Yeah, I'm looking at this example. I believe you could do the same with direct integration with DynamoDB and just checking response error codes from DynamoDB and return custom response the same way.
I think so. I think what we found on our team more is that when the integration like Dynamo returns a different error response. So for example, if we take a look here, actually that was fine here, but in my experience, that when Dynamo, when the integrated service returns with a different error response object, response code, we'd have to catch it at this level. So if it was like a 400, we would have to put a regex, like add a new mapping here. And the regex, I think, is like, I'm going to ruin that. I'm not even going to pretend. But we have to catch at this level. And then we could, as you said, we could put its own mapping template in here to define that more personalized or more custom error response. So actually today I was working on something like this, and I was catching in my step function. What was I catching? I was catching a condition expression exception from DynamoDB, and it was for a create. And so in that case, I could put a 400 in here and catch, just as we were in the VTL, I could check that the error message was the check condition expression. And then I could, as you say, customize my error message.
Yep, thanks.
So these strings, are these returned by Dynamo?
You mean this string right here? Not these ones will not be. However, we could, Dynamo would not return these specific ones. As I was just saying, Dynamo would return its own error messages that it uses for its particular context. Like I was saying, when you were writing, let me pull up an example. When I make this request using terminal to AWS Gateway to DynamoDB, and I pass in this key condition. And I pass in this key condition expression. Actually, query is a bad example. If this was a put item, and I had this key condition expression, and it was saying update only when this key condition expression matches a current item. So when the PK equals this partition key, and when the SK equals this sort key, if it did not find that record, Dynamo would respond with an error code. It would respond with, yeah, I think it's check condition expression error or something like that. That string I could match on in here and formulate my response. Where these are coming from is within a step function. I could configure a step to perform some business logic, and then I could formulate this pass step in the step function to return these specific values. So what we've done on my team is we've generated some like familiar, some reusable steps that our different step functions can use. So we'll have like a not found step, sorry, state is the correct word, a not found state, a forbidden state, and a request state. And then throughout our step function logic, we'll just perform some choice states that will say like, if this is that, or if it's not, throw a not found state. And then we can reference that and catch it here and return with the appropriate response.
Are those defined in the TS file, the step function.ts? Or?
They are, yeah, absolutely. Those common ones are not, but I can absolutely attach them. Those are.
That's fine, just get an idea.
Yeah, totally. But they would be like let me, if I could do it like this, I could do like an add catch, and let me see how much Git Copilot will do for me here. No. Git add catch error state, and I think what I want to do is I want to add a parameters somewhere in here. I forget exactly. Oh no, it's here. I could add in a parameters like this, and I could go, I think it was capitalized, so I could go like this. This is essentially what we're doing. I could go like this. Item not found. So why don't I change this to not found? That makes more sense.
So it's like C++ exceptions. You can define one or more, right?
Sure. I've never worked with that, so I can only say sure at this point.
That sounds good.
Yeah. And my syntax is not quite right. You see it's complaining, but it's along these lines.
Yeah, that's good.
So what we've done is, as I'll just continue my example, is we've abstracted these pass states here into their own file, and then we just import them and reference them in the TypeScript, just as you would another exported value in TypeScript. Where was I? We were discussing this. We were discussing the VTL. We were discussing the step function response VTL. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. We were discussing this. We were discussing this. We were discussing this. Discussed this, and the configuration code. Yeah, exactly. So we just quickly looked at the step function code. We've looked at the mapping templates for both the request and the response. Let's take a look at our CDK stack again and see what does it take to configure this step function integration into our API gateway. Into our API gateway, we are first going to say build our step function, because previously we didn't have to do this because we didn't have anything that we needed to connect the gateway to the Dynamo, but this time we do. We're building our step function. And then we're going to add a resource, add our get method to the resource, and then specify what that method is going to do. And in this case, it's going to be an integration. It's going to be a post method. Just trying to remember where I have to do that. The type, the options, credentials, roles, request templates. Yeah, and I'm reminding myself here that I don't even need to specify that it's going to integrate with a step function in here. That it does it. Yeah, it will handle it for me. But I think I don't remember. I took this and I don't remember the first time I did this was so long ago. I don't remember exactly why I don't need to say that it's communicating with a step function, but I'm pretty sure it's because of the URI that it knows that it's going to communicate with a state and it's going to start its the synchronous execution. But again, my request template, I haven't configured this in the other VTL format simply because I want to show that this really is just a string, a key value pair within this request template that we can manipulate as we want to by using string concatenation or whatever, right? And then in the response, again, I'm just reading that file and extracting it to a string to associate with the response. Simple as that. Any questions?
Hey, Talis.
Hey, Greg.
Sort of a similar question to what I asked about VTL.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds like here we're talking about using the step function, not just for orchestration, but also for business logic as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, one way you could test a step function's business logic is to do that end-to-end integration test.
Yeah.
Have you found anything better when testing step function business logic than end-to-end testing?
For like automated testing?
Yeah.
No, we haven't. Now, actually, one thing that we've done is we've argued lately, like how much value do we actually get out of adding in some automated testing to the step functions? Reason being is if you, like, one thing I specifically said was that it should perform simple steps. And the steps should be simple enough that, you know, adding automation into it, what's the return on investment is arguable, right? What we've also found is that using the UI, using the new step function UI within AWS console has been an absolute dream for us to work with. Way better development experience than working with the VTL templates. But for example, it's kind of one of the things that I regret about not actually building a more complex step function for us to look at is that last time I ran this, I hope I ran this even. I did, thank goodness. Once here, what am I looking at? I'm looking at the step function within AWS console. And AWS has done a really great job at allowing us to improve it, like really creating a development experience for us to work within this step function. So let's try that actually. No, I'm not going to try it live. I'm going to screw it up, but let's play with it. I feel like playing allows me to make mistakes unashamedly rather than trying, you know. But let's say I want to edit the state machine. So there's a couple different things I can do. Traditionally, I really enjoy working with the JSON here. It's really easy for me to configure. So look at me, here I go. I'm terrified. But no, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. But the new Workflow Studio, if we go into the Workflow Studio, I am happy to show this though. So what am I doing here is this is actually like, it reminds me of Squarespace, where you can actually drag and drop different states that you may want to use in your step function flow. So again, the reason I kind of was happy to argue that this is configuration code instead of application code is because you literally can come into AWS console and configure this business logic without writing any TypeScript or JavaScript or Java, anything, right? And so what I want to do is let's just take a pass. And I'm going to drag this down here. And pass name, next state is going to go to end. The input, filter input, put bad. No, I'm going to leave it like this. And the output, it allows me to manipulate what the output is going to be. And well, I'm going to apply an exit. I think it allows me to do that. Yep. But what I like to do is I want to go back and look at my previous execution that I had within this past week. Okay, and it allows me to actually click on this state here. And it allows me to really in-depthly view what was the input, what were the values that were input into this state, and what were the values that were output. And the reason I wanted to come here is because I wanted to see like, okay, what am I going to do with this past state? Now, actually, this past state that I put is going to be more complex than I would like to just dive into live here. But I could put it prior and manipulate this input and change these values. Like, let's actually go play with that. Where did I go? Here. Let's go to the Workflow Studio. Let's take this and put it before. And let's go here and we can manipulate this input, no, output. I just want to change it to, oh, sorry, it likes to be book ID as book 2. And then let's go chapter ID, chapter 2. So what I'm hoping is going to happen is that it should be receiving the previous input, chapter 1 and book 1, and it should be ignoring those and changing them to book 2 and chapter 2. And we should see pretty much the exact same response because it's filtered, it's built with the same page numbers, but hopefully the IDs on there should be just a little bit different. Continue editing. I need to push save. And then I am going to go back and find the previous execution just because it allows me to reuse the previous input state. So I'm going to go to new execution and see here was a previous input state. I'm going to go start execution. And this should run against the most recent version. This isn't unfamiliar to me. It is it takes a little bit of time because we're building up the state machine. But so the input into the past was book 1, chapter 1. The output was book 2, chapter 2. And so that would be, those would be the values that were actually passed into get managed dashboards. And we can see based off of this sort key here, I can see that the book 2 and chapter 2 were actually used during the query request. Phew, live playing, let's say.
So then, Tallis, you've edited your state machine in Workflow Studio, but yet your state machine was defined using AWS CDK.
It's true. It's true. So what do I do now? Right? That's the question, right? What do you do now? You're out of sync, Tallis. What are you going to do? So this is actually my typical flow. Again, is I build it up as best I can in CDK. I'll then come into the console and manipulate. I find it much easier to debug and more efficient to debug within the console. Now, the awkward step is this does take a little bit of learning, is how to efficiently transform this JSON object that is configured here into my CDK configuration. And yeah, there is some skills and practices that just take time to develop, but I would not say it's like learning C# or C++ or anything, it's just matching what is happening here to the CDK documentation. And it's actually pretty okay. It's not super challenging, but again, once you've done it, AWS manages this for you, manages the logs, manages the provisioning, managing, like, if anything, if there's any ever vulnerabilities that they find, it's all taken care of for you. There's no future management or investment costs for you. So we're kind of coming close to the end of my presentation. Those were the two scenarios that I wanted to present. I did want to follow up, though, with some challenges and limitations, because there for sure are some challenges and limitations when working this way. But as you can probably guess, like, we personally find every scenario that we can to implement our endpoints in this no-code style. But when logic or actions within the mapping, so one of the limitations is that the logic or actions within the mapping template, we do provide or apply real limitations on the types of requests, the types of actions that we can do. Like, for example, a real common case might be when working with DynamoDB is you have to get two different types of items from your DynamoDB in order to build an appropriate response or to perform the appropriate business logic that you need to do. So for example, you need to perform one query to get me my books. Like, let's say I wanted to know the author on the book, which I know from if that's on the book item. The other thing is I may want to know some information about the chapter. So I would need to make a get item and a query, or a get item about the book and the chapter, and I would have to merge those results together. Often cases, if you're having to do remotely complex things with arrays, performing that in either performing that within a step function just becomes too complex and is no longer the basic business logic that we discussed. So we find that putting that in the Lambda is absolutely worth it. A number of reasons. Greg has been challenging against testing, right? You get to provide the automated testing when needed, when your business logic becomes too complex to just trust your manual verification. Later, the integration mapping templates, as we've alluded to, the development experience can be challenging. We've talked about that. We've also talked about that there's no way to efficiently validate the template functionality outside of API Gateway beyond trial and error. If anyone has a way outside of this, please, I'd love to learn. And finally, the documentation for capabilities of VTL within API Gateway, they are there and they speak exactly to what the capabilities are. We on the team have struggled to limit our creativity and our desire to the way we want to use those templates to the documentation. We think that there should be more there for us to use, but there's not. And we find that a challenge, limiting ourselves to the documentation rather than trying to think outside the box as we developers like to do. But to be honest, those are the main limitations that we find. Those, and if those are them, if that's the exhaustive list, we absolutely love working with this approach and passionately look for opportunities to. So in conclusion, what we looked at a typical serverless approach where we were building an API gateway and connecting our DynamoDB using a Lambda to act as that intermediary to perform the business logic required. And we looked at ways to replace that with a direct integration or using a step function. Now, the 3 points that I wanted to highlight is that why is this important? I want to leave you with this. Why is it important? Why do we find it important to think about the serviceful approach? One is that throughout this, you've seen me try to take shortcuts to try and avoid thinking about complexities that we may not need to, right? Again, provisioning, logs, I've already discussed them, but ignoring all those, they allow us to focus our efforts on the business logic and the business challenges that we're trying to solve, rather than configuring our services. I also wanted to highlight, and we've already discussed, that these direct integrations are not limited to the DynamoDB or step function that I presented. It's an unexhaustive list. There's so many. And then finally, that VTL, even though I've complained about it and we've talked about its limitations, its challenges, it really does offer a ton of flexibility. Like one example on the team that we're doing is that we're not just returning JSON or response objects. We're actually building an iframe, an HTML object using the template and returning that as one of the responses from one of our endpoints. So there is a lot of flexibility that we can do, and we can use these templates. I'm by no means an expert in how the many different ways that we could use it, but we love learning about it and excited to keep challenging ourselves with it. So with that, I want to open up if there's any final questions and say, here's my contacts. Please reach out with any questions. or follow-ups. Absolutely, I'll look to make this code open source. I apologize. I tried to get to it earlier yesterday, but we're trying to sell our house, and there's like some crazy stuff that happened that I just couldn't get to it yesterday. I ended up having to dig a 3-foot hole in my front yard to try and find the water main coming out of the city. So yeah, I apologize. I didn't get that for in time for this. But again, yeah, any questions, please, or comments, concerns, learnings, anything anyone would like to share.
There is a question in chat. How does step function part scale? How to find the performance bottleneck for this system?
Great questions. In terms of the scaling for the step function, yeah, again, we haven't really performed any benchmarking, but I do know that like step functions are designed to handle like large loads and large orchestrations. So let's say if you needed to if step function was a solution for you where you needed to perform actually quite complex pieces of logic at the different states, you could connect your step function to a Lambda and orchestrate those different Lambda functionalities as you move through. The one nice thing about step functions is that it has a really long runtime. So your problem won't be with the Lambda runtime or anything like that. Actually, the problem will always be with the API Gateway runtime. So again, I'm going to struggle to answer this question in-depthly because we haven't benchmarked that on the team or really pushed it. We've always used these these serviceful implementations for simple, low-level requirements or endpoints, but yeah, we will get to a point where we are for sure going to challenge that and see how far we can push it.
Yeah, I can probably chip in into this as well. So step functions is a serverless managed service by AWS, as any other serverless offering from AWS. It actually scales pretty well. So you basically pay for execution, you pay for provisioning or of some capacity, and it actually scales almost infinitely as long as you are ready to pay.
Exactly.
And the bottleneck will usually be something that is not managed, like your relational database or your container or your EC2 instance that has limited capacity.
But it's very good. It's very good limit for your scalability, like your pocket. How much you're ready to pay. Sorry, Mike, for interruption.
Yeah. So the point is that there's absolutely no problem with the bottlenecks for any such services like step function, Lambda, DynamoDB. Just provision more if you want.
I have a question for Thales.
Please.
Thales, what do you think? What will be next? Like we already have serverless. Right now we are talking about serviceful. What will be the next in software engineering? Like how software engineering is going to look like in 5 years? Codeless, blockful, whatever. Any idea, any insight?
You already ask myself that every day. How can I get rich faster than anybody else by thinking 2 years ahead, But I personally, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is because, yeah, I think that, look, I can't answer that question. What I can answer is, what do I want to be in 2 years? What kind of what do I want my job? What kind of things do I want to be doing? And the truth is, I don't want to be making those decisions that I was telling you about. I don't want to have to make those. I wanted to pay someone else to do those. And I want it to be cheaper than what I'm currently paying right now. And that's exactly what these implementations, I think, are doing. They are removing my need to worry about my auditing logs. They're removing my need to worry about the provisioning. And if I'm pricing and configuring my Lambdas to be the most efficient in terms of performance and cost. I want to build applications that I can sell, and I think that these types of implementations allow me to do that faster. And so, if I can, the more I can do that, the faster I can do that, the more valuable I'll be to either my employer or to myself as I build my own application, as I become an entrepreneur, right? So that is how I see myself moving, is trying to cut those corners as much as possible.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I am extremely grateful and humbled that you guys came today. Again, please reach out with any questions anytime. I'd love to learn from anyone who has any comments. That would be my goal from this. So thanks a lot. Really, thanks a lot.